I'll tell you what, you sure look like one. You remind me of myself in my prime. Son, you're going to have to beat the women off you with a stick. The colonel shook his head, asking me if I'm not proud of you. How could I not be proud of you? TJ looked down at the table, but I could tell he was smiling, like that's all he needed the colonel to say. After that, everything broke loose, especially the colonel's tongue. The man could talk some talk, and that night we got an earful. Someone had turned the opera back on. Now, you want to talk about a man who looked good in his first uniform? The colonel said, leaning back until his chair tipped. He turned to my mother. Tell these children, Jeannie Pooh, what a handsome rascal I was when you first met me. When my mother just shook her head and laughed, he turned back to me and TJ. Oh, she's just too embarrassed. Well, you never saw a woman throw herself at a man the way your mother threw herself at me. Oh, Tom, my mother said, blushing. Even though this was approximately the 8,000th time the colonel had told us the story about the dance where he and my mother met. Oh, I don't think that's exactly what happened. The colonel winked. Don't buy this modest little act of hers. She was brazen that night. Shameless might be the better word for it. I slipped into the colonel's story like it was a comfortable pair of old sneakers. I could have told that whole thing word for word, acted it out with all the colonel's winks and asides. I knew it so well. I glanced at TJ, who was grinning like a kid, suddenly not looking so combat ready. I knew he was thinking the same thing. It was good to have the old colonel back. We went out into the backyard after dinner to toss the football around. Even my mother, who not only had an amazing wealth of knowledge about the Washington Redskins, the colonel's A1 number 1 football team, but was also a fairly accomplished wide receiver. All right, everybody, go out for a long pass, the colonel commanded, and the rest of us ran towards an imaginary end zone, across the heat-blasted grass, past the tomatoes and the black-eyed Susans. The colonel lobbed one at my mother, but it flew over her head and went bouncing off into the grass. TJ scooped up the ball and spiraled it back to the colonel, who shot it to me. I pulled that baby out of the air and made a beeline for the line of floribunda roses the colonel had planted at the edge of our yard. They were big, showy flowers, the babies of the garden, threatening to fall down and die if you didn't bow to their every whim. I squinted my eyes and pretended they were the opposing team's defensive line, veered left, feinted right, and dove through a gap in the middle. That's my girl, the colonel yelled from the other end of the yard. You show me Jamie Dexter and I'll show you a girl who can play some football. I rolled onto my back and smiled up at the sky. At that very minute, everything was right with my world. But TJ was only home for the weekend. On Monday, we drove him to the airport to put him on the plane for California. In California, he'd board an Army transport for Vietnam. It was finally happening. I walked next to TJ through the airport, proud to be seen with him in his combat fatigues and polished-up boots, an olive green duffel bag slung over his shoulder. My mother, of course, started to cry when she reached TJ's gate, but she tried to act like she wasn't. She stood up straight and pretended to brush something off TJ's shoulder. You be sure to eat, she said, before half a sob got caught in her throat. I don't want you getting too thin. TJ kissed her mother on the cheek. I will, Mom. I'll eat everything they put in front of me, I promise. The colonel shook TJ's hand. No heroics, son. Just do your job and make us proud. Yes, sir. I didn't know what to do. We weren't a family of huggers, but I felt stupid just standing there. Finally, I stuck out my hand, and TJ took it. We shook solemnly. Write me letters, I told him. I want to know everything that happens to you. TJ leaned over and ruffled my hair. I'll keep in touch, he promised. He started for the gate. I ran after him. Hey, TJ, I yelled. Pathfinders! TJ turned around and saluted. Combat ready! and then he walked through the gateway and disappeared. Once TJ was out of sight, Colonel sighed and shook his head. "The only way out is through," he said to no one in particular. "The only way out of what, Tom?" my mother asked him. "The whole darn thing." The colonel began walking towards the car. My mother and I trailed behind him. I, for one, didn't know what he was talking about, and I didn't much care. I was wound up tighter than a German clock. TJ was going to Vietnam. My brother was going off to war, just like we'd always dreamed of. Chapter 13. The colonel was in the backyard when I got home from Cindy's. He liked to sit out there before dinner to admire all of his botanical accomplishments. Usually he didn't do more than gaze reverently at his flowers, since my mother hated anyone to come to the dinner table dirty. But today he was underneath a forest of tea roses pruning. I sat down on the grass beside him and plucked a few blades. I didn't know how to say what I wanted to say. I needed a strategy, but I didn't have one. I knew I was about to ask something impossible. How do you go about doing that? "Hand me my pruning shears, would you?" the colonel called from where he was kneeling deep beneath the leaves. "She's getting out of control down here." I passed the colonel his shears, handle first, the way he had taught me years before, when I had wanted to be his garden assistant, just like TJ. It had been a boring job that consisted mostly of fetching the colonel glasses of iced water and every once in a while mixing up a brew of fish emulsion and manure tea. I had quit after a few Saturdays. That tea stunk to high heaven. Sitting back, I took a deep breath and plunged in. "You think the war is going to be over soon, sir?" The colonel pulled his long frame out from underneath the roses. "It's going to be on as long as it needs to," he said, sitting up and wiping some crumbs of dirt off his cheek. "But it'll take some time to get out of there." Okay, next question. "Do you think it's right for the Army to send someone to war whose brother has already been killed in the war?" "Was this person drafted or did he enlist?" "Enlisted." I hope this was the better answer. "An enlisted man has chosen the military, and he's responsible for fulfilling the duties of his enlistment agreement. Now, it might be taken into consideration that his brother has been killed, but that doesn't mean he won't be sent if he's needed." The colonel stood. Pieces of mulch clung to his pant legs, old combat fatigues he wore around the house on weekends. He leaned down to brush them off. You hear of men enlisting after their brothers have been killed in war because they want to have a crack at the enemy. Revenge. I don't know if that's a good reason to enlist or not, but it makes for some pretty motivated soldiers. "I don't think Private Hollister's after revenge." The colonel gave me a look. "Hollister? Your rec center buddy? Is that who we're talking about?" Private Hollister heard that they were sending radio operators from 1st Signal Troop to Vietnam. I stood up and immediately wished I were taller. The colonel might take me more seriously if I weren't such a runt compared to him. But he thinks it's going to be really hard on his mother if he goes, since his brother died there. And he says you're the one who signs the orders. I figured if you didn't sign his orders, he wouldn't have to go. It wasn't the #1 argument I'd been hoping to make, but it laid the cards on the table. "I'm asking you not to sign his orders, sir," I finished up. "I know it goes against Army protocol, but it would mean a lot to me if you didn't sign them." "You're asking me not to sign his orders?" The colonel's voice was flat, disbelieving. I nodded. The colonel scratched his head and then brushed back his hair with his hand. "Who do you think I am? Tell me that, sport. Who do you think I am? Do you think I'm Santa Claus?" "You used to be, remember?" I was scrambling, trying hard as I could to win the colonel to my side. "Mom told us that you used to get up on the roof and jingle bells and stomp around like a reindeer." The colonel didn't say anything. He sat down in a lawn chair in the middle of the yard. He rubbed his eyes, put his hands down in his lap, then stretched his legs out and shoved his hands in his pockets. He looked vaguely confused, like he wasn't sure what he was doing in this particular backyard on this particular Friday afternoon in this particular century. Back when TJ enlisted, when it was all a done deal, I made a call to an old buddy of mine, the colonel said, sounding like he was about 100 years old and 100 miles away. Just got his first star. Used to be Colonel Sunder, now he's General Sunder. Next time I see him, I'll have to salute the guy. He's at Fort Jackson, Adjutant General's Corps, Personnel Command. I asked him to make sure TJ didn't get shipped over to Vietnam, to pull whatever strings he could. Man, he chewed me out, up one side and down the other. Dexter, you darn so-and-so, he says. You want your son kept out of Vietnam so somebody else's son can go and get himself killed? The Sunders were at Fort Leavenworth, I said. I couldn't focus on what the colonel was telling me. I couldn't quite take in the fact that the colonel had tried to pull strings to keep TJ out of Vietnam. That went against protocol. It was against everything he'd ever told me about the Army way of doing things. Honor, duty, sacrifice. Wasn't that what he'd been preaching to me all of my life? But all I said was, I remember Colonel Sunder. He had a scar on his face, on his cheek, where a dog had bit him. The colonel didn't seem to hear me. Maybe I ought to be ashamed. Sunder sure thinks so. But it's a worthless war, and I don't want any son of mine anywhere near it. He looked up at me. I'd let somebody else die for TJ. God forgive me, but I would. It's a worthless war. My mouth hung open. The colonel was calling Vietnam a worthless war. We got into it for the right reasons, the colonel said, leaning forward and looking straight at me, like he needed me to believe him. That's what all those anti-war types don't understand. They don't understand that the Soviets and the Communist Chinese are a real threat to our security. We can't let them have Southeast Asia. The colonel sat back in his chair and frowned. Problem is, we don't know what we're doing over there. We're in over our heads. It's a jungle war against an enemy that's just plain smarter than we are when it comes to that kind of fighting. If we had any sense, we'd admit defeat and get out. Save a lot of lives that way. I sat down on the grass. The tips of my fingers and toes went numb. Did you tell TJ that? I told him over and over. He wouldn't listen. He's 18 and thinks he knows everything there is to know. Does he know you tried to keep him out of Vietnam? You're the only one in this family who knows that. Your mother doesn't even know. The colonel pushed himself out of the chair. I thought college would keep TJ out of the war, but I was wrong. I thought I could keep him safe, but I was wrong about that too. He began walking towards the house. He looked old to me then, his shoulders sagging, his head low. Before he got to the back door, I called to him, Colonel? He didn't turn around, but he stopped. Will you help Private Hollister?